This is a video response to a recent dialogue between John Vervaeke, Jonathan Pageau, and Jordan Hall. It was posted on Jonathan Pageau's YouTube and titled "But Why Christianity?" and I'll provide a link in the description. And first of all, it was an absolutely fascinating conversation. Pageau and Hall are Christians. Hall being a recent convert to Christianity, and Vervaeke being, well, hard to describe exactly. Certainly a believer in the sacred, a Neoplatonist, a Zen Neoplatonist, I think, is one description that he gives himself. He's a cognitive scientist, and so I guess the key thing is he's not a believing Christian. So it was really interesting to see his discussion with Jordan Hall and Pageau, because he was kind of pushing back at them a little bit and voicing some of his concerns with Christianity as he sees it. And so, this is, I guess, where the subjective comes into it. Everyone is going to see this conversation in a slightly different way depending on where they are in relation to these subjects. So, to be clear, I am not currently an Orthodox believing Christian. Very interested in religion in general, very interested in Christianity, come from a Christian background. And also recently took a relatively deep dive into Nietzsche, and recently uploaded a commentary of his greatest work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and that also contributes to these thoughts somewhat, because, well, I've titled my video Jordan Hall's Dionysian Christianity, and I admit it's a bit of a provocation, but what really struck me when I watched this was the way that Jordan Hall was talking about Christianity. It struck me as very Nietzschean in a way, not in the sense that Nietzsche would describe Christianity like this, almost in the opposite sense, but in the way that Nietzsche would describe the relationship that we should have to life, the relationship that we should have to the world, to the earth. Jordan Hall was saying similar things, and I'll play a clip in a moment to show you exactly what I mean. But that was really interesting to me, because one of the things that I'm kind of thinking about, thinking through at the moment, is the relation of Nietzsche's thought to Christianity, and more broadly about different ways of relating to the world that we find before us, that we exist within, which was certainly Nietzsche's concern, and of course is the concern of all religions, and especially Christianity. So this is not, just to be clear, a polemic against Christianity. I'm not a Nietzschean, just as I wouldn't identify as a Christian. I wouldn't identify as a Nietzschean. But I'm genuinely striving to find the truth, or get nearer at least to the truth. And so this is my attempt. So this is, well, perhaps a little provocative, not meant at all in bad faith, not nasty in any way, not polemical. And if I sound like I might be drifting in that direction, it's just because I want to steelman the position that Nietzsche's putting here, to hopefully get a response, or think of a response that is as strong as possible, or alternatively to recognize that there is no valid response. So in any case, If any of those three people are listening, that is to say Vervaeke, Pageau, or Hall, I'd love to talk with you, especially Jordan Hall, since this video is kind of in a way focused on you. I'd love to have a conversation and talk about this some more. In the meantime, I will just play the clip now, and then I'll kind of talk about what this means for me.
Okay, let's see. So it's almost like the reverse direction. This notion of escape versus immerse, right? The call is not to alleviate suffering. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. The call is actually to recognize that the world is so rich that suffering is intrinsic and meaningful, something like that. Right? That God, the actual transcendent, Buddha nature, but in this case, comes into reality and lives directly with other people and suffers. In fact, not just suffers, but allows himself to take on the fullness of suffering. Not to have us escape it, but to remind us that that's actually the thing.
Okay.
Right? We are not. It's not like, oh man, suffering was an error. Tell you what, guys, I'll give you a suffering Band-Aid so nobody ever suffers anymore. That's not the thing. It's rather, no, the way this thing is supposed to work is you're descending into a deeper and deeper capacity to suffer, because that's what engagement with reality actually is to undergo, right? To undergo reality, experience, and to grow and to mature. And so instead of dying and escaping, what happens is you die and you enter into even deeper capacity to enter into relationship with a large and ever-expanding reality. And this, again, this is the opposite of a naive notion of non-duality, which is an elimination of difference, right?
Right.
It's actually, no. It's an embracing of difference in a deeper wholeness that produces a deeper capacity for differentiation in an ongoing unfolding.
Okay, this was really good.
This was really good. This was really something that I would tend to agree with, first of all. Although I would say rather surprising as a description of Christianity. So this conversation talked a lot about escape, I guess, versus immersion, which is where Jordan is coming in here and talking about immersion in reality versus escape. The way Pageau kind of characterizes Eastern religions tends to be that they're oriented towards escape, whereas Christianity apparently doesn't fit into that category. Although he does acknowledge that Christians have got it wrong, and of course Jordan acknowledged that as well. I don't think they've got it wrong so much as that it's inherent in the logic of the religion. And again, I'm not saying this definitively for all time, but and I'm not saying this just as polemic, but that just seems to be the case. And so I guess I'm being a little bit vague right here, but this will become more clear in a moment. So I'm going to read a quote from Nietzsche, and this is a quote that I've talked about with Aaron van Os, who's a Nietzsche scholar, wrote his thesis on the religious aspects of Nietzsche, or the tension and that Nietzsche had with Christianity, the kind of the overlaps perhaps, or the harmonies that are also there. So we've had some really interesting discussions about this, and we've brought up this quote before, and it's kind of definitive in a way of Nietzsche's conception of Christianity and his conception of where his philosophy sits in relation to Christianity. His philosophy being characterized by Dionysus, which is the Greek god of wine, which is more than that, God of affirmation of the earth, versus, what he's calling the crucified, which is, of course, Christ, the crucified God. And so in this quote, which is included in Will to Power, which wasn't a published work by Nietzsche, but was a kind of collection of his notes. So this is the note. Now I'll read it out, and then I think at least some aspects it will be clear how they relate to what we've just heard from Jordan Hall. Dionysus versus the crucified. There you have the antithesis. It is not a difference in regard to their martyrdom. It is a difference in regard to the meaning of it. Life itself, its eternal fruitfulness and recurrence, creates torment, destruction, the will to annihilation. In the other case, suffering, the crucified as the innocent one, counts as an objection to this life, as a formula for its condemnation. One will see that the problem is that of the meaning of suffering, whether a Christian meaning or a tragic meaning. In the former case, it is supposed to be the path to a holy existence. In the latter case, being is counted as holy enough to justify even a monstrous amount of suffering. The tragic man affirms even the harshest suffering. He is sufficiently strong, rich, and capable of deifying to do so. The Christian denies even the happiest lot on earth. He is sufficiently weak, poor, disinherited to suffer from life in whatever form he meets it. The God on the cross is a curse on life, a signpost to seek redemption from life. Dionysus cut to pieces is a promise of life. It will be eternally reborn and return again from destruction. So in that quote, obviously, you see, flashes of Nietzsche's own polemical attitude towards Christianity. The Christian denies even the happiest lot on earth. Is that strictly true? Well, no, and I think that certainly that's not the case for someone like Jonathan Pageau, for instance. He is sufficiently weak, poor, disinherited to suffer from life in whatever form he meets it. This is Nietzsche's criticism of Christian morality as resentment, essentially, resentment against life, stemming from weakness. Which is a valid criticism of some forms of Christianity and some forms of morality, but which doesn't seem to be applicable to everything, and which certainly doesn't seem to be able to characterize the entire Christian religion. So those are just some disclaimers there. But I think that the central dichotomy between these two kind of archetypes, I suppose you could say, or orientations to being, I think that is valid. And so what I mean by this is, where is, it's about the meaning of suffering. Now, Jordan Hall's just said that life is, that suffering is intrinsic to life. I believe he said something to the effect that suffering is intrinsic and meaningful. Even to the extent that God would want to immerse himself in the world to fully experience it, to fully connect with it, to fully love it. Suffering is not something to be done away with. Again, very, very surprising words to characterize Christianity, and I'll sort of dive into that in a moment, but is part of the thing itself. And this is essentially Dionysian. This is Dionysus in Nietzsche's sense. This is the sense that life is just in itself good, valuable, just as it is. So yes, life includes suffering. That's the nature of life. Being, reality, the world, all of this needs suffering, pain, chaos, resistance, darkness. All of these aspects are tied up intrinsically with all the good things in life, joy, beauty, even perhaps holiness, if you want to admit that into your worldview. All of this is kind of interdependent. And for that reason, to the extent that you affirm life, you affirm everything. You affirm all of it. And in this talk between these three, the topic of agape comes up, and I think it's Vervaeke says something to the effect of, that parental love is the archetype or the prototype of agape, which I think is fundamentally true. Agape being self-giving love, self-sacrificial, self-giving love, perhaps. And I think that is fundamentally true. And I guess why I brought that up is that true, fair, and you don't need to be a Christian to know that life is valuable for your children, and you don't need to be a Christian or to have any kind of Christian metaphysics, notion of God or anything like that to recognize that even though bringing children into the world is necessarily bringing them into suffering and chaos and so on and so forth, it's still good, it's still valuable. True, some people actually nowadays would reject that. But I think that plenty of people that don't have the worldview of Christianity would affirm that. And I think that you can just, if you need irrefutable proof of that, that would just be that in the ancient world that was also true. In the pre-Christian world or in non-Christian societies, that was also true because, people had children, people raised children, people sacrificed themselves in different ways for their children, knowing that life is suffering. And Buddhists even have children, amazingly. So that's just to say that we kind of intuitively know, at least if we're not consumed by resentment or profoundly sick or profoundly weak in a really deep and fundamental way, we kind of know that life is good, that life is joyous, and that this life actually includes suffering. Nietzsche draws the conclusion that therefore what we're really doing when we affirm life is we're affirming the suffering as well. We're affirming the whole thing. And in that sense, it has a tragic meaning. We're all going to die. We don't know when. We don't know how. It could be terrible. If it's not terrible, terrible things will happen to us in the meantime. But Nietzsche's whole quest, in a way, is how can we live in such a way? How can we orient ourselves to being in such a way that nonetheless, we can say to life, again, one more time, again and again. This is the notion of the eternal return. In other words, affirm it just as it is. Now, Christianity is different. I think I better jump to my next slide to kind of fully illustrate this. So yeah, I've been talking about the first point, at least in the side of Dionysus. Life is fully affirmed as it is. That as it is actually really critical here because, so what I mean by that is life as we actually find it, life as we actually experience it, the physical world, the biological world as we actually know it and observe it. Not some other metaphysically posited world or reality, but this specific reality. This is what is fully affirmed in sort of the Dionysian orientation to life. But so let's jump to the other column, the crucified. Now, Nietzsche might not even grant this much potentially. I'm not sure, because he does attack Christianity pretty severely. And I think too severely and too one-sidedly and too absolutely. But I think we could at least say that for Christian, life is partially or conditionally affirmed. So let's take the most life-affirming Christian that you can think of. I'll pick on Jonathan Pageau here, just because we're kind of talking about this talk that he includes him. Because, he's an Orthodox Christian. That's a pretty, I would say, grounded and embodied and beautiful and joyous, let's say, instantiation of Christianity. Although, of course, it has its asceticism as well. And Jonathan himself is an extremely joyous person, which I'm sure is deeply related to his Christianity. And you can kind of see it in that talk because he's always kind of chuckling. In any case, before I go too far afield with that thought, that train of thought. So let's take the most joyous Christian, the most life-affirming Christian. The question would be: is life being fully affirmed in this case, or is life only being partially or conditionally affirmed? Now, this is just to do with the structure of Christianity. This is just to do with the logic of Christianity. In the logic of Christianity, the world is fallen. Now, that doesn't mean that we're totally depraved. That doesn't mean that the world is just suffering, just evil, or anything like that. Again, you could take Jonathan's very life-affirming, orthodox view, capital O, orthodox view of things. But life is still lacking. Existence is still lacking. Existence is still, in some sense, fallen. It's pretty clear. It's pretty clear in the Bible. It's pretty clear in all the dogmas of Orthodox Christianity. That, when sin came into the world, creation fell, and it's not as it should be. And so that to me seems just it's simply not a full affirmation of life. At least it's not a full affirmation of life as it is, the life that we actually experience. Now, the Christian could respond to that by saying, yes, but it's a deeper affirmation of life. Life as it essentially is, not life as it happens to be at the moment. I totally credit that as a possible response. But then we get into a kind of metaphysical quagmire. Well, what exactly is this essentially good life that you do affirm? That in affirming you must deny the negative aspects of life as we find it. What actually is this? How can it exist? We get into the problem of just interdependence in general, the interdependence of opposites, just like actual physical laws and actual physics and actual biology and all of known science. How is it that existence could be without chaos, without pain, without resistance in some sense, without darkness in some sense? What does that even mean? What would that even look like? What would eternal life look like? What would an infinite duration look like if we want to conceive it that way? Or what would timelessness look like if we want to conceive of it that way for a human individual that is essentially temporal and essentially finite? Well, essentially is begging the question, but let's say all that we know as human individuals is temporality and finitude. At least it seems that way to me. I haven't been given any greater insights in terms of that, but maybe I'm unfortunate in that respect. Okay, so that's the first point. And this comes to suffering. This is directly related to suffering. So for Dionysus, suffering is affirmed as part of life. Like, suffering is unavoidable. And so to say that suffering is affirmed is not to say that one seeks out suffering, and it's not to say that one seeks to inflict suffering. That doesn't follow. That's not implied logically by what we're saying here. The affirmation of suffering is kind of like the acceptance of suffering, but more than that. It's that this is just a necessary part of existence. It's part of life. It's going to happen, and it can't be avoided. And the flip, the other side of suffering is violence, and that's also unavoidable. We'll talk about that, I guess, a little bit more when we talk about morality. Suffering is constitutive of sentient existence. This is the Buddhist insight. It's just a profoundly true insight. And even though one also should follow that by saying that joy is also constitutive of sentient existence and potentially is deeper. That's the Nietzschean claim anyway, or the Nietzschean challenge. But let's say suffering is constitutive of sentient existence. Violence is constitutive of sentient existence. Violence is essential. Violence is necessary. Violence, feeds us, sustains us, constitutes us, from this, all the way from the cellular level to the level of groups, species. It's, in a sense, violence all the way down. Of course, at a certain point, you might not characterize it as violence because you're dealing with, let's say, inanimate objects or particles or so on and so forth. But actually you can kind of still see, even in the lowest levels of reality, this kind of collision of energies that on the higher levels of reality are, would be characterized as violence and suffering. And this is the Nietzschean insight as well, that life is will to power. I don't want to get ahead of myself though, but life is the surging, seething self-expression of energy. Okay, so to look at the side of the crucified or the Christian side, suffering has a different role. So again, I would concede as much as I possibly can to Jordan Hall and Jonathan Pageau, in that I think you can totally be Christian and affirm life to a certain extent and enjoy life to a certain extent is good. And likewise affirm suffering as necessary to life as it happens to be now, that is to say, fallen. On a relative level, on a tentative level. But when you get to the depths of it, what is the Christian project? The Christian project is ultimately the abolition of suffering. And what role does suffering play at its best when it's not just, playing the role of an essential part of life as it happens to be? Suffering is a means of redemption. A means of redemption. A redemption from what? A redemption from the world constituted by, well, that's again a question begging word. Let's say currently a world currently characterized by suffering, by pain, by sin, by evil. This is what Christians is trying to get free of. To a world that is again perfect, to the essentially good form of being, to the perfect form of being. And so the highest, let's say use of suffering, or the best orientation to have towards suffering, is as a means of redemption. And this is, I'm not sure how that fits into Jordan Hall's thought exactly. I believe he talks about self-sacrificial love, but certainly in the clip that we heard, suffering was doing the job more of just being part of immanent existence, an existence that's actually so valuable in itself that the transcendent God would immerse himself in it to experience it, which actually is, I will grant, a beautiful image. Is it a strictly Christian image? That's a different question. So, suffering is a means of redemption. Now, this could be, this could be one's own individual suffering, as a means of redemption. This is the role of asceticism, of course, fasting and so on and so forth. It could be, but we could also just be talking about the suffering of Christ, the suffering of Jesus, his self-sacrificial suffering, that, the sense in which he suffered for all of us to gain our redemption. So in both of those models, or it could be both, it could be both at the same time, the idea of carry your cross and walk with Christ. But in both of those models, suffering is the means of redemption, whether it's our suffering, whether it's Christ's suffering. Suffering leads to redemption, and that's its highest use. That's the highest purpose of suffering, is to lead to its own abolition. But again, this is different from the Dionysian orientation, which doesn't envisage an ultimate redemption from suffering. There may be a relative redemption from suffering in the sense that it contributes to joy by being part of life. There may be an aesthetic redemption of suffering in the sense that the whole of a life is beautiful, or can be seen as beautiful. The sense that life can be fundamentally taken as aesthetic. The sense that a tragedy is beautiful. And that's why in that quote that I read just before, Nietzsche talks about the Dionysian being the tragic view of life, as opposed to the Christian. Now, one final thing I'll say, because, I mean, this is throughout the Bible, or at least especially throughout the New Testament. These ideas that I'm talking about, the idea of fallen creation, the idea of suffering as means of redemption, and of course also the world that is envisaged, that will come, that will, I want to say replace, but that's maybe a loaded term. Let's say transform the world that exists currently into the world as it should be, so to speak, as the perfected creation. And so in this talk, Pageau referred to actually the ending of the book of Revelation, where this actually happens. This is, the vision of the perfected world. So, what is the place of suffering here? Let's have a look. I'll read a passage. Just find it. Okay, so this is the book of Revelation, chapter 21. This is the ESV translation. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne, saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more, neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. And, so that's the quote. That's the end of the quote. And it is a beautiful passage, and it goes on, and it continues in a beautiful way until the end of the book, till the end of the Bible. A couple of other things to mention, I guess, would be that there's no more darkness. So we've heard there's no more sea. The sea is obviously a symbol for chaos, and there's no more sea. And the other thing is there's no more, night will be no more. That is chapter 22, verse 5. And night will be no more. They will need no light of lamp or sun, for the Lord God will be their light, and they will reign forever and ever. So, no chaos, no darkness, and no pain. So, that's the world as it should be. But if that's the world as it should be, then, well, are we to affirm the world as it is? Well, I would think not. And again, this seems to be consistent with, for instance, the letters of St. Paul. It seems to be consistent with at least certain passages from the Gospels. It seems to be consistent with a large number of saints in the Christian tradition, or at least, certain quotations of them. This is escapism. Now, so the Christian might object. It's not escapism if there's something real to escape to, and I would totally grant that. But in relation to this life, it is indeed a will to escape. It's not immersion. Or at least I don't see how it's immersion. If it's a kind of immersion, it's a strategic immersion. Like, again, suffering is a means of redemption. So you would think that, okay, I'm immersing myself more fully in life, I'm immersing myself fully in suffering. There's a difference between the Dionysian sense of that and the sense in which it is, in the Christian sense of that, which is, the The Dionysian doesn't see anything beyond that, but sees suffering as manifestation of life itself, and in that sense good in a perhaps non-moral sense, but in a deep sense. And the Christian sees suffering as something to immerse oneself into, to redeem the world, to redeem their soul, and to redeem the world itself. And that latter is not selfish, it's a noble aspiration. But it is saying no. It is saying no to the world. It is saying no to life itself. And so I don't see how Christianity is not escapist. Now, in order to talk about the last 2 points, I'm going to need to play a couple of more clips from the talk. So both of these concern self-sacrificial love and the part that it plays in being as a whole. So yeah, here goes.
Well, I think that the thing that comes to me when you're saying what you're saying is that Christianity, I believe Christianity really does, in its highest instantiations, really does have a sense that the source of reality is non-dual, right? That the way that we describe God as a Trinity is a way to describe the infinite, right? Not a way, but it's a manifestation of the infinite in a type of aporia that joins unity and multiplicity together. Saint Maximus says things like, God is being and non-being.
Yeah, exactly.
That type of language. Now, I think what Jordan is bringing up, which I think is really important in the vision of Christianity, is that Christianity deeply understands that non-dual is not it's not a vortex that swallows the world into it, right? That's not something that wants to call you out of being, that wants to call you out of reality into some like infinite bliss or whatever. That in fact what it does is that it affords all of reality in it, but in a specific way, right? There's a specific manner in which it makes the world exist, and that way it is surprising at the outset, because that in that way is something like self-sacrificial love.
Yeah.
And that the self-sacrificial love is the mode of existence. And so Christ manifests that in the extreme. He manifests that in the, in a way that is kind of almost unbearable to watch, but it becomes an image of how it is that we can participate in non-duality without escaping the world. We're not escaping our desires. We're not escaping our bodies. We're not doing any of that stuff. We're not denying any of the goodness of the world. And what that looks like is that image. I think it's that image that I mentioned in Revelation, which is the king and the sacrifice together, right? The highest and the lowest joined together, and one of them affording the other, right? The reason why Christ is king is because he was on the cross, and and vice versa. That image of Jesus on the cross with the sign above that says the king. This is the king, folks. And I think that all of Christianity is about that. And that's why everything that Christians argue in the first centuries about the nature of Christ, about preserving his divinity, preserving his humanity, all of these questions are about the way in which the transcendent is actually that which makes the immanent exist. And that's the balance that Christianity brings about. Now, I don't know if there are other, I'm not.
So that was the first one, and in the second one, Pageau is going to go into that idea a bit more. That idea of self-sacrificial love as being the mode of existence, what that actually means in a more fleshed out way. And so the I won't play this part, but the question that kind of prompts his response is from Vervaeke. He asks him, why is this not just a crypto egoism, namely the desire for eternal life is driving this, or that's the assumption. So why isn't this just a form of egoism? And so this is Pageau's response.
Think about what it looks like in practice. What it looks like in practice is I am constantly trying to cease to exist. That's in the sense that Christianity, the idea of kenosis and of self-emptying.
Yeah. Keep going.
The way that Christianity functions is like humility, self-sacrifice, of giving yourself in love, and the surprise, or the surprise to realize that that's the actual anchor of being, that's the actual anchor of how you exist, and the resurrection in the end. What is resurrected is all my gestures of self-sacrifice are resurrected into me, but me obviously in a mysterious way, in a mysterious. So there is something. Everything about Christianity is this kenosis. Without understanding that, you can't understand any of it. Like why do we have martyrs? Good. Why do we have all these things? Like it's like everything about it is this emptying that brings fullness.
Okay, so you're saying something.
So I'm going to just skip forward a bit through through Vervaeke's response, just so I don't break the kind of momentum of what Pageau is saying. I think it might be there.
You see why there's a bind there, right? And with what you just, this really had really crucial. A bit of a paper tiger, okay?
Well,
okay, there we go.
So, St. Paul, St. Paul has this image where he says it's not I that live, but Christ that lives in me, and it's a beautiful sentence because it captures the paradox, which he's not actually saying I don't exist anymore.
No.
Saying it's Christ that lives in me. And so he's affirming himself to the extent that he is a manifestation of the Logos. And that is what is left. Now the way to get there is to shed, right? To shed a lot of the things my passions, the things that I care about, but that ultimately once you do that, and you can experience it fractally. It's not like I'm going to get to the end of it and all of a sudden I'm going to realize, I've been self-sacrificing this whole time, and so now finally it's like you see it happening nonstop, which is that when you enter into a loving relationship with someone and you let go of your just proper desires and all the things that you want, and you kind of cede way to that, then you realize that it brings the person, you and them together, and what comes out of it is more than what was there before. And so you're like, oh, wait a minute. It's not like this one thing that I'm doing. Like, I'm stacking all my good work so that when I die, then you know what I mean? It's like, no, I'm noticing it happen every day, every time that I enter into that mode of being where I'm not holding on and I'm not grasping. Then what happens is I see more come out of it, and I see more of myself. Like I see more of who I truly am, right? To say,
yeah. So you're saying first of all, I hear.
So Pageau responds to Vervaeke's question or challenge, isn't this just a crypto egoism, by pointing out the connection between self-sacrificial love and greater being, which exists fractally, which one can see in many different aspects of life, that one can experience in many different ways all the time, and which in the first clip is grounded in the relationship between the transcendent or the non-dual God himself and creation, which I'm reading into this a little bit, but I take it as meaning, God in some sense sacrifices himself for the immanent world gives it space to be, gives it autonomy, gives it its own being. This is in a sense a sacrifice. Although what specifically this means in relation to the absolute non-dual being, I don't know. It kind of, if it's more than just a helpful metaphor or pointer, then one has to suppose that God is a being, that God is a self, which certainly Vervaeke has a lot of trouble with, and that I think I would have a lot of trouble with too if we're thinking about this philosophically. How is that possible? But anyway, so Pageau grounds self-sacrificial love in the absolute, and says basically that it's the anchor of being. That's actually what he does say. He says it's the actual anchor of being. Self-emptying, self-sacrificial love is the anchor of being. This is how things are. So there's a lot that's true in there, and pretty much everything that Pageau says is wise, deeply wise in multiple ways. So I don't want to downplay him or his thought at all in any way. And there's lots of things I could say about all that he said here. Certainly it's true that in actual life there are many, many times where sacrificing yourself in a loving way, or let's say sacrificing myself specifically in a loving way, is enriches me as a self, enriches the world, leads to greater being. I can totally see that. But I would take issue with what Pageau says about it being the actual anchor of being, because it seems to me that being is a bit more complex than that. It seems that it's not just all about self-sacrificial love. It seems that being is maintained and increased not just by self-sacrificial love, but also by selfish love, self-love, selfishness. These terms are already preloaded with negative value connotations, so I don't have another positive term necessarily to use, but I actually mean that. I mean that selfishness is essential to life. When we're looking at the absolute in some mystical, mysterious way, maybe we can say that creation, the relation of creation to the absolute, is one where the absolute is emptying itself in a self-sacrificial form of love for creation. Understanding, though, I would say that that is essentially a metaphor or an image for something we can't possibly understand. When we're looking at creation itself, when we're looking, let's say, from the bottom up, the situation looks very different. I would say it looks like will to power, which is, of course, Nietzsche's term, and it looks like selfishness. And that's very easy to see. It's not complicated. Beings are out for themselves, and beings consume other beings, and beings strive to preserve themselves. Now, beings also have this other quality of striving not only to preserve themselves, but striving to reproduce their kind or their species. And I think that's where agape comes into it. Vervaeke mentioned agape being parental love, prototypically. And so this is part of the picture of life. This is part of the whole thing. But before you even get to that, you have to have a being, growing and preserving itself, and also winning a mate, which is also, a assertive activity, let's say, or a selfish activity. Certainly involves selfish desire, and that's the intense ambivalence, let's say, that a religion like Christianity has around sexuality. Sexuality, violence, selfishness, etc. But all of these are actually constitutive of being. And so when we're thinking about parental love as a prototype for agape only can arise out of, a lifetime of selfish love. Now, obviously, within that selfish love, there's within that self-love, there's other forms of love as well. Reality isn't simple. Reality isn't just one thing. But that comes first, and the child as well. So the child isn't an image. The baby isn't an image of self-sacrificial love. The baby is the most intense selfishness. So like always needing, always grasping, kind of manipulating its environment, obviously all in an instinctive way. But this is sort of a pure expression of life itself. This is the thing that latches on to the parental love. And of course, parent and child are both served by this, but one has to be a child first, one has to be a baby first, one has to be selfish, and then one has to be an adult also in a selfish way, in a way that one preserves oneself, in the way that one expands oneself, in the way that one lives. This is the way that life actually functions. And then there's self-sacrificial love. So basically, I'm saying that the situation is complex, and that the situation of life itself doesn't seem to be solely to do with self-sacrificial love. So it seems strange that the resurrected self would be constituted of all my gestures of self-sacrifice. My actual self isn't constituted by all my gestures of self-sacrifice. It's constituted largely, but not exclusively, of selfish gestures. That's what makes me an individual self. I don't see how you can separate these things out, and just sort of like keep those acts of self-sacrificial love, and just not have the rest of the self, which it seems to me is constituted largely by selfishness, violence, expansion, will to power. And I don't see any of these things as being inherently negative, or at least I don't see them as being like basically fundamentally negative, because they are just how life functions. And so the other thing I would want to say about this is that self-sacrificial love, agape, or things like this can actually flow out of a will to power. But we have to understand will to power in a particular way. So will to power in Nietzsche's sense isn't a sort of graspingness. That's a kind of weak and petty selfishness. That's a selfishness of someone that doesn't have the capacity of expanding and taking what one needs. But actually, like true will to power, that is to say, will to power that is existing in someone that is actually powerful, that actually is full of life energy, that will to power automatically overflows into self-sacrificial acts. And there's at least a couple of places in Thus Spoke Zarathustra where you get a sense of this. So one place is in the most important place in the book when it comes to talking about will to power. This is the chapter on self-overcoming. This is what is this? This is chapter 12 of book 2, I believe. Yep, chapter 12 of book 2 on self-overcoming. This is where he talks most explicitly, Nietzsche talks most explicitly about the will to power. And so the will to power is distinguished from the will to life or the will to existence of someone like Schopenhauer, where there is this kind of graspingness, clingingness to existence. One wants to exist just for the sake of continuing to exist. But the Nietzschean will to power actually goes further. It overflows into what essentially amounts to sacrifice. So this is part of what he says. And as the lesser surrenders to the greater, that it may have delight and power of the least of all, so the greatest too surrenders, and for the sake of power stakes life. The devotion of the greatest is to encounter risk and danger and play dice for death. So this isn't exactly self-sacrificial love, but it's akin to it, I would say. The sense is of an overflowing life itself, giving oneself up for something else. For the sake of power stakes life. For the sake of power, yes, but not in that grasping way. Not in that sense of I need more power. I need to keep power. I need to grasp and hold on to power. But in the sense of being fueled by power, I would say. In the sense of being energy that needs to expand, that needs to overflow. And then, that can take many, many different forms. So it could take this kind of like playing dice for death. It could take this kind of like form of the conqueror that's going out and fighting battles, knowing that they might die, kind of kind of thing. But it could also look like service to others. It could also look like self-sacrifice for one's family, self-sacrifice for one's country, for one's friends, for one's religion, potentially. Especially in Nietzsche, it can also look like self-sacrifice for ideals as well. Although he typically characterizes the religious man as being fueled by resentment, he also has a kind of respect for certain religious types as being actually needing to expand themselves in this way, and needing to express their energy in this really ascetic way, this self-sacrificial way. So I would say that's where it comes into Nietzsche's thought a little bit. And then the other place I would see it is, let me just find the chapter. So this is the end of book 1. And this is actually where he contrasts two different types of selfishness. Let's see. Yeah. Truly I divine you well, my disciples. This is what he says. You aspire to the bestowing virtue as I do. What could you have in common with cats and wolves? You thirst to become sacrifices and gifts yourselves, and that is why you thirst to heap up all riches in your soul. Your soul aspires insatiably after treasure and jewels, because your virtue is insatiable in wanting to give. You compel all things to come to you and into you, that they may flow back from your fountain as gifts of your love. Truly, such a bestowing love must become a thief of all values. I call this selfishness healthy and holy. And then he goes on to contrast it with what he calls the sick selfishness, which is what I talked about, which is a selfishness that stems from lack. Selfishness that Nietzsche celebrates is a selfishness that stems from abundance. And this chapter is actually called on the bestowing virtue, which is also can be translated as the gift-giving virtue. And it obviously talks about sacrifice. The one who is sort of full of life, the one who is full of abundance, and who has an abundance of power, and an abundance of power that is sort of taken from others as well, in a sense, as it necessarily must in the world that we actually live in. Wills to give it, wills to overflow, wills to give it up. And again, that can take many forms. So I see a kind of continuity between will to power and self-sacrificial love, in the sense that will to power is the precursor to self-sacrificial love. Will to power is, will to power is more fundamental in the sense that first we see a manifestation of will to power, and then we see self-sacrificial love as its blossom or fruit or something like that. So when we think about a very young child or a baby, when we think about basic animals, what we actually are witnessing is sort of almost but not entirely pure will to power most of the time. Maybe when we look at objects, physical, non-inanimate objects, we're looking at just pure will to power, in the sense that we're looking at just pure energy, or something like that. And maybe there's also hints of self-sacrificial love in there. I don't know. It's possible it's all bundled together, just like there's hints of consciousness. But that thought is going too far afield of what we're talking about. So I guess another further point that I would make about this is that, again, everything is interdependent. Like, self-sacrificial love without will to power? What if everything was just self-sacrificial love? And it seems like that would be what the perfected creation would be. It would be that there's only self-sacrificial love, everyone giving to everyone else all the time, in every way. And one has to ask the question, what does this actually mean? Is this a coherent picture of a possible state, a possible way of being? The actual world as we actually live in, we have self-sacrificial love fueled by will to power, in the sense that the power we've acquired expends itself in self-sacrificial love, entwined with will to power, in the sense that I, in a sense, define myself by what I sacrifice myself for. So, for instance, I'll sacrifice myself for my family, but I'm also defined by my family. Like, my family are my family. I have and the very fact of having love for them means that, they're a part of my being. They are constitutive of my happiness, of my joy. So will to power, like as my family grows, I grow, is also tied up with will to power. The alternative would be a kind of, I sacrifice myself out of pure duty. And that's not the conception that I get from Pageau or Christianity in a traditional Christian sense. There's too much joy, especially in Pageau's presentation of it. There's too much feeling and there's too much emotion. It's not just sort of like, I must negate myself, I must sacrifice myself for others, I must do my duty. I think we can just discard that from the outset as a possibility. So let's get back to the slide. For Dionysus, for the the archetype of Dionysus, will to power is fundamental. And you could say that that's looking at reality from the bottom up, which is an easier way to look at it than from the top down, if by the top you mean non-dual being or something like that. Will to power is fundamental for Dionysus. That's the thing that comes first. That's the thing which is the basis for the overflowing of will to power out of life, or out of narrow selfishness within life, right? So when my will to power overflows into self-sacrificial love for others, and I don't die, but a part of me dies maybe, and I expand, I actually grow. That's another way it's continuous with self-sacrificial love, because it is actually true that as you sacrifice yourself, you grow. And I think you can actually see that quite readily with courage, which is a martial virtue. So if your self-sacrificial love, maybe this is wrong to invoke self-sacrificial love here, I don't know. It's a certain kind of self-sacrifice anyway, and it's maybe driven by a love for what's right, or a love for what you could be, or maybe a love for others if the courage that's being displayed is for the sake of others. In any case, my sense is that if I sacrifice that part of myself that wants peace or comfort or the same for this, for the sake of facing the unknown, then I do grow. But it's unclear to me, or the unknown or the dangerous or whatever. I do grow. But it's not clear to me that that's separate from will to power. It seems that it's a continuum, because I do actually feel myself grow. And eventually, if you accustom yourself to being courageous or doing what you're uncomfortable with, that actually becomes something that you positively relish, because you actually feel yourself grow in it. And so I don't see that there's a strict cutoff from that, and say sacrificing yourself for the other person that you are in a marriage with, or sacrificing yourself for your child, or sacrificing yourself even in the extreme for someone that you meet for the first time but is in distress, something like that. So that's the Dionysian side. The side of the crucified, though, is a bit more complicated, because there's no claim that I can see that self-sacrificial love coming from the top transforms into will to power. It seems that, again, the reason that self-sacrificial love is valorized so much, apart from its inherent properties of expanding being, in particular cases, the reason that it's valorized in an absolute way is that it negates being as it is. And I think this is what Nietzsche also intuited or detected, but of course he goes somewhat overboard, I think, and sort of reduces it all just to resentment. But I think that a more sober and a more reasonable way to state Nietzsche's case would be that you can't just have self-sacrificial love by itself, and you can't have that and just live in the reality that we have. The reason I think that self-sacrificial love is so valorized by Christianity, even if it's not practiced consistently by Christianity, the reason it's valorized is because it looks towards a future state of being where there is no violence, no suffering, as we talked about before. That seems consistent. That seems to be the essence of the Sermon on the Mount. And so one has to, and this is where it becomes really crucial, and this I'll merge, I'll seg into my last point now about morality. This is where it becomes really crucial, because a worldview that does not acknowledge violence and will to power as being constitutive of being is in some way fundamentally opposed to being. It is in some way neurotic, and it is going to have negative effects because it's not in accord with being. So if self-sacrificial love is the thing that you should embody at all times, without reserve, that will actually, I would say, if the only being is the being that we actually know and actually experience, that actually will disintegrate being. Now, if there is a mysterious way that being is more than this, that being is somehow free of suffering, free of chaos, free of all of this stuff, and is sort of perfect but also individual, and allows for individual variation, I don't know how that could be. In that case, yes, okay, I will grant that self-sacrificial love is totally, the essence of being itself. But until then, if I can't grant that, then self-sacrificial love is, if it's the only value, is disintegrative of being. And so, someone like Tom Holland, I haven't read the book Dominion, but I really want to. But his case is, as I understand it, as I've heard it, essentially that Christianity led to the values that we have today. Christianity sort of reversed the pagan values of the pagan values of the ancient world of Greece and Rome that, by the way, Nietzsche did love, because they situated humans within nature, and they basically acknowledged or affirmed violence as being constitutive of being, and then the Christian values reverse that to sort of end up in modern humanistic values, something like that. I think that's fundamentally true. Not 100% sure about the detail, but I think that trajectory at least is true. And so then the question would be like, where exactly is this going? A lot of people are concerned about woke values, like woke culture. Is that the next permutation of this Christian humanistic trajectory? That this genuinely is going beyond humanism into the next level of non-violence, the next level of self-sacrificial love, the valorization of the victim, etc., etc. Possibly. It seems to be a very, very similar logic, even if some of the metaphysics have changed. That's where it would be dangerous. That's where it would be disintegrative of being, disintegrative of society, disintegrative of self. Like a deep, deep confusion that's linked to saying of the world as it actually exists, the natural world, that includes our natural bodies, no. Saying no to it. Rejecting it. And so that brings me again to that last point. What is the role of morality in relation to life itself? And so, for the Dionysian perspective, morality, it's not that morality doesn't exist at all, but it's relative. Morality is something that exists within societies, within groups. It creates a certain order within groups. It's not dispensable, But it is in fact relative. It's relative to those groups, the goals of those groups, and most essentially, it's nested within life. It can't be applied to life itself. It can't be applied to the world itself. You can't say, is the world good or bad in a moral sense? It's just inappropriate to assess the world like that. Now, the world is essentially good. The world is fundamentally good, and there was a bit of talk about that in the dialogue as well. Nietzsche would agree. I mean, that's how he sees the world. Although it's complicated, but I don't think he would say that it's something that can be proven, but that's certainly the orientation that he has, like logically proven. But that's certainly the orientation that he has to the world, or he had to the world. But that good, like Vervaeke pointed out, is a good that goes beyond the ethical. It's not the ethical good that he's talking about there. The world is good, the world is to be affirmed. That's basically what it means. All of it. So good and evil in the relative moral sense are both to be affirmed. And so that's the Dionysian perspective. And then the Christian perspective is that morality is absolute and ultimate. It's absolute, it's grounded in God, the absolute being. It's ultimate. It can in fact be applied to life because, again, nature is fallen. Human nature and physical nature are fallen. And they need to be redeemed. The world, including human beings, needs to be reconstituted or transformed, transfigured into something else or something more or something deeper, to be more charitable. But something that it isn't currently, or that it doesn't manifest currently. That's a judgment on life. It's an ethical judgment of life. Christianity is very, very concerned with sin and redemption. They have an ontological import. So, if you have only self-sacrificial love as being the value, the thing that grounds being and perpetuates being, and you have morality as absolute and ultimate, the thing which judges life itself, I would say that, again, if this life that we live, as we actually experience it, is what exists and no other life, this is profoundly, profoundly disintegrative of this life, and it is escapist, and it is rejecting, and it is essentially a denial of life, because then all violence which is essential to life becomes suspect, becomes uncomfortable. Now, going back to the Dionysian perspective, does that mean that one should be particularly violent, that one should try to get one's way all the time? I don't see that at all. If there's no need to be violent, why be violent? Although I think it does acknowledge that a lot of what we do, which we don't consider to be violent, the way that we assert ourselves, the way that we're creative, the way that we love, the way that we desire, is also, if not rooted in violence, deeply entwined with violence. And that's something that we shouldn't be especially uncomfortable about. That's just something that is. That's just something about the way we are as beings. So I think that that's the great benefit of the Dionysian perspective, is that we can be more comfortable in the world. We can... we don't have to be alienated from the world, and we can be violent when we need to be violent, right? Even explicitly, directly violent if necessary. There's no essential ontological betrayal there. There's no fall there. There's no sin in the deepest sense there. But most of the time we won't be directly violent. And that violence will actually be, the violence that is constitutive of being, when it's not operating in, in the biological level of, digesting flesh or whatever, or, treading on insects or whatever it may be. But on the psychological level, that violence will just be sublimated into, whatever. There's some of the things that I've talked about, desire or creativity or whatever it may be. Or self-sacrificial love, as the case may be, the being rich enough to give of itself. But then the self-sacrifice is a bit different, so maybe I'll round it out with this, because this was something that Nietzsche touched on in his quote about Dionysus versus the crucified, is that, and let's just go back to it actually. Yeah. Okay, Dionysus cut to pieces is a promise of life. It will be eternally reborn and return again from destruction. So the reference there is to, I believe, to when the Titans, the kind of anti-gods of Greek mythology, tore Dionysus into pieces, and he was later reborn. I believe his heart was saved. He was sewn into Zeus. It was sewn into Zeus's thigh, and Zeus gave birth to him through his thigh. There may be other myths as well about his reconstitution. I'm not sure. That's the one that I remember. So Dionysus himself, like Jesus, is a dying and reborn God. But the message of Dionysus, at least for Nietzsche, is not that life will become something that's different from life as we know it, a perfected life, a life without suffering, but that life will be, that the same type of life will return. That yes, there's destruction and death, but there's also birth. That being will remanifest itself and express itself. The energy of being will create new forms and enjoy them and express them, and the whole thing will recur in that fashion. And so that's the immanence of life repeating itself. And again, that's different from the message of Jesus. Jesus dies and is reborn in a perfected body, in a transformed body, which then ascends to heaven, which is difficult to think about, but are there bodies in heaven, of what type, etc.? But the symbolism is very clear. So the immanent is being translated into the transcendent in some way, but keeping its immanence. This is the Christian thing, I think, that the reality that we have now is to be replaced with a better reality. It's different from the certain Hindu notions, maybe Buddhist notions, that the immanent, or at least myself as a manifestation of, as a part of the immanent, will transcend, will escape, will return to the one non-dual Brahman, which is what Pageau criticizes. Although I think that there's more complexity there, just like there's more complexity with Christianity. When Pageau doesn't like people criticizing Christianity, then I think criticizing Buddhism and Hinduism is like, well, there's actually a lot of complexity there, and a lot of things that go beyond that simplistic reading. But anyway, that's at least one part of Hinduism and Buddhism. I'll just get back to that slide. Yeah. So I think I'll leave it there. I mean, like I said, this is the thing that I'm thinking through at the moment. I'd appreciate any thoughts that anyone has. I'm really happy to talk with pretty much anyone. Just reach out to me, and I'm happy to arrange something if by some great miracle Jordan Hall, John Vervaeke, or Jonathan Pageau happen to see this video and they want to engage. I am absolutely more than happy to do that. And again, I'm not trying to be polemical. definitely part of me would like Christianity to come out on top in this sort of debate or posing of the opposites, posing of Dionysus versus the crucified. But at the same time, I think personally for me, accepting life and even more affirming life as it is has been actually really healthy and helpful. Reading Nietzsche has actually been really healthy and helpful. I think there's an immature way I could have read Nietzsche, or did read Nietzsche actually. And then there's a more mature, more sort of, more mature way to read him, where it doesn't have to be all about rebellion. It doesn't have to be, that kind of egotism, but sort of a more sophisticated, more mature form of will to power, selfishness, something like that. I return to the question, is Jordan Hall's Christianity a Dionysian Christianity? And is a Dionysian Christianity even possible? Is Christianity not inherently un-Dionysian? That is to say, isn't it essential to Christianity to deny life in some way and wish to escape from life as it is? Isn't that just part of it? Is this a problem? Isn't this a problem? How do you kind of deal with that? Am I missing something really essential here? Am I misunderstanding something? These are all questions that you could help me answer, whoever you may be, if you have some thoughts about them. So I really welcome any engagement. And so I'll leave you with those questions, and I'll leave you, of course, with the dichotomy, the challenge: Dionysus versus the crucified.